way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but freed people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay?
Come on.
You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
What's up, family? Welcome back. Once again, California Reparations Task Force Report Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, right here on Men, the Mass Media Group, 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, West Coast, Fresh Coast, along with the other Fresh Coasts as well. East Coast, South Coast, Middle Coast, North Coast, all coasts. So today I'm going to put in the chat box here, we're going to be talking about pathologizing black families. It's going to be the topic today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen pretty soon. So far, we've gotten some pretty good feedback on this report. So it seems like, the information is imperative and people are listening to it. What's up, Darlene? How you doing? Always appreciate you, sis. As always, Darlene be putting in that work. Shout out to Darlene. Always appreciate you. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you're listening to this live, or you'll be listening to this on the replay. All right, so let's go ahead and start the read, shall we? Not too sure how long this read is going to be. I know usually we end at 10 o'clock. Most likely we'll probably end at 10 o'clock as well tonight. So I don't know if you have your libation, if you're chewing on some popcorn or whatever. Oh, by the way, I guess it's like basketball season or something like that. And so I really do appreciate everybody who's tuning in right now to listen, because you could be watching, basketball that, the N word. I'm not going to say it. Basketball Association. Yeah. It's funny because, oftentimes, quick interjection before we start, especially with freedmen people, we often get caught up into these athletics and watch all these games, and we're starting to have more black coaches, basically no owners in these organizations. We're starting to have, I see a lot more black quarterbacks now in college and in the pros, so that's good. But yeah, we don't own pretty much anything yet. We will bend over backwards to go or watch the game either in person or on TV instead of educating ourselves. But I digress. Then again, I know we all need a release, so I'm not trying to hate on people watching athletics. I do consider myself an athlete or an ex-athlete, so I've been on the gridiron, so I know it firsthand. So I'm not trying to persuade people either way not to watch it, but saying we all need a little bit of more education in our lives, I would say. Anyway, well, speaking of education, hopefully we'll be getting some education tonight. So let's start. Chapter 8. Pathologizing Black families. Starting over 400 years ago, the federal and state governments of our country have decimated Black families, both through their own official action and inaction, as well as through creating and supporting systems in which private actors enacted racist policies and practices. After the end of the legal enslavement of African Americans, the apprenticeship system and segregation laws denied African Americans the stability and safety of the family unit. In the past century, both financial assistance and child welfare systems have based decisions on racist beliefs about African Americans. As a result, these government-run systems have excluded African Americans from receiving benefits and targeted Black families for investigations of child mistreatment and neglect. Further, these structures have placed Black children in foster care systems at much higher rates than white children. Meanwhile, the criminal and juvenile systems have intensified these harms to Black families by imprisoning large numbers of Black children, thereby separating Black families. All of these actions have systemically worked to deny African Americans opportunities to form stable, supportive family structures, and have often further stereotyped and blamed African Americans themselves for the resulting harms. As a result, these government-run systems have included African Americans from receiving benefits and targeted Black families for investigations of child mistreatment and neglect. Further, these structures have placed Black children in foster care systems at much higher rates than white children. Meanwhile, the criminal and juvenile justice systems have intensified these harms to Black families by imprisoning large numbers of Black children, thereby separating Black families. All of these actions have systemically worked to deny African Americans opportunities to form stable, supportive family structures, and often further stereotyped and blamed African Americans themselves for resulting harms. Quick interjection. I think it's imperative that we as freedmen people, that we stop blaming ourselves, because we are the victim. I know sometimes we feel like we want to, and I could be preaching to the choir here, but if I'm not, oftentimes we've been told, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do it here in America. Just listen to me, family. This is not our fault. Okay? So, and I think in this particular chapter, it will definitely make that more poignant, but we'll go ahead and keep reading. All right, let's do it. Section 3 of this chapter addresses the treatment and dissemination or decimation of family structure among Black enslaved persons during the slavery era of American history. Section 4 discusses the Black family from emancipation until the Civil Rights era, during which government structures and policies empowered the continued enslavement of Black children, excluded both Black women and Black men from healthy parenting relationships, and continued to deny the legitimacy, both literal and figurative, of Black marriages and children facts, so as to ensure white wealth was not dispersed to them. Section 5 addresses the Moynihan Report, which largely blamed the culture of Black families for the injustices faced by African Americans and proposed deeply problematic solutions to remedy them. Section 4 addresses direct cash assistance welfare programs, from their overtly racist origins through modern programs that continue to systemically disadvantage impoverished Black families. Section 7 lays out the history of... Oh, okay, wait, hold on. Did I say Section 4? I'm sorry, my bad. That was Section 6. Section 7 lays out the history of the foster care and other child welfare systems in America, discussing the myriad ways in which that system further attacked the Black family and denied them resources afforded to other Americans. Section 8 addresses the criminalization of Black youth who are targeted consistently both within and outside of schools, further breaking families apart. Section 9 addresses issues relating to Black families, Black victims of domestic violence who are doubted and excluded from assistance in ways that many white victims are not. Okay, so hopefully they'll talk about, I don't know if in this chapter they'll talk about the stereotype, especially that Black women were welfare queens, which was definitely a huge stereotype and misinformed and misinformation. So let's continue. That was an interjection. All right, enslavement. Throughout the slavery era of American history, federal and state governments empowered and protected white enslavers in their destruction of Black family structures by treating enslaved people as chattel, unworthy of family love, care, and support. The transatlantic slave trade and reproductive slavery. As Frederick Douglass observed over 250 years ago, genealogical trees do not flourish among slaves. Wow. Shout out to Frederick Douglass. Ashe. The vast majority of the nearly 400,000 enslaved persons brought over from Africa were children or young adults, and more than a quarter were children. Upon the Okay. Alright, for some reason I don't know. Upon the arrival of enslaved people in the United States, private parties and state governments maintained no records of their origins, replacing their names with those of their new enslavers, names by which they were called throughout their lives. This erased an individual's identity, severed them from their family, and made it extremely difficult for them to find each other after emancipation. See Chapter 2, Enslavement, for more detailed information about this process. And I think I've mentioned a couple times reading, if not already, and if not in this report, to read a book titled The Last Cargo, I think it's called, by, I always flip this sister's name, the great ancestor and author, Nora Zilhurston, anyway. It's basically based off the brother Kasola, I think was his last name. I can't remember if that was his last name or his first name. And his seasoning process per se, and his unfortunate kidnapping and sold into slavery, and his transatlantic, guess you want to call it journey for lack of a better word, over here into America. And how it basically erased his identity, but he was able to, as best as he could, keep what he remembered, from the motherland. So anyway, let's continue. Federal and state governments passed laws that protected enslavers' ability to destroy black families and use black women and their children as a way to increase the wealth of enslavers. Before 1662, English law governing American colonies held that children of enslaved fathers were enslaved, but the child of enslaved women and white male enslavers were free persons upon their birth, thereby entitling them to the full protection of the law. This changed in 1662 when the colonial government of Virginia passed a law stating that all children born to enslaved mothers were enslaved themselves, regardless of whether or not the father was white, black, enslaved, or free. This law created a new source of wealth as enslavers used these children to settle debts, pass on larger inheritance, or otherwise enrich themselves. The doctrine underlying this law became known as partus sequitur ventrum. That's Latin for that which is brought forth follows the womb. Wow. All right, so I'm gonna put that in the chat. So we know that, when anybody, what's up, Theo? How you doing, family? So when everybody's trying to come at us talking about, we don't know what we're talking about, we gotta understand what we're dealing with. And so we have some information to obviously back us up. Partus sequitur ventrum. Let's go. The United States outlawed trafficking enslaved people into the country in 1807. The only legal way to increase the number of enslaved people and free labor for the American economy was therefore through domestic birth of new enslaved persons. This created a financial incentive for impregnating black women and girls and carrying the pregnancies to term. Historians have found evidence that enslavers raped black women and forced them to birth children to create more enslaved people and further enrich their enslavers. Professor Dana Ramey Berry has argued that this sexual slavery served to provide great benefits to both government and private actors within both the southern and northern states. The labor of black enslaved people created wealth for their enslavers, sustained cotton production and other private industries, and paid state and local taxes across the country. In the North, maritime industry, merchants, textile manufacturers, and even consumers of cheap cloth were all dependent on the southern cotton plantation economy, which was based on the sexual slavery of black women and men and the destruction of black families. Professor Berry argues that enslavers focused on the fertility of young black women during slave auctions, and that early childbirth was considered to be a valuable skill. Wow. Like housekeeping and clothes mending. Enslavers consider the birth of enslaved infants not with humanity, but appraised them with a monetary value, one that typically increased as they aged. Marriage between enslaved people. American governments prohibited or did not recognize marriage between enslaved people. Facts. Across the southern enslaving states, enslaved persons were generally prohibited by law from entering any legally binding marriage. Abolitionist William Godell described the way that American law treated the families of enslaved people in 1853 as, "The slave has no rights. Of course, he or she cannot have the rights of a husband, a wife. The slave is a chattel, and chattels do not marry. The slave is not ranked among sentient beings." Wow. The slave is not ranked among sentient beings, but among things. And things are not married. Oh, yo. I mean, interjection. I mean, you talking about the original people on the planet, bro. What are you talking about? Sentient. Anyway, let's get back to it. That was an interjection. I think I said that. Let's get back to it. Tennessee was the only enslaving state that allowed for marriage between enslaved persons, but the law required consent of the enslavers for the marriage to be valid. Because enslaved persons were not considered to be human beings under the law, they could not enter into legal contracts. Where are we at? Okay. Therefore, enslaved people could neither own nor transfer property, which is what American law recognized their husbands, wives, and children to be. The North Carolina Supreme Court in 1858 said, "The relation between slaves is essentially different from that of man and wife joined in lawful wedlock, because with slaves it may be dissolved at the pleasure of either party, or by the sale of one or both, dependent upon the caprice or necessity of the owners. Their condition was compatible only with a form of concubinage, voluntarily on the part of the slaves and permissive on that of the master. These attitudes and legal mandates were not limited to the South. One notable example is the case of Basil Campbell, who at the time of his death in 1906 was one of the wealthiest black men in California. He arrived to California from Missouri in 1854 as an enslaved person, forcibly removed from his wife and 2 children who never saw him again. After his death, his 2 adult sons from his marriage in Missouri sued to seek their inheritance, leading 3 different courts, including the California Supreme Court, to reject their claims. Indeed, one appellate court held, nearly 50 years after the legal emancipation of enslaved African Americans, that describing Campbell's marriage to his enslaved wife as a marriage would be a mockery of the institution. Interesting. So I wonder if I didn't say anything in terms of what the results came out of this. If anything came out of that, It's interesting. I'm gonna just put this in the chat, just for notes. See what happened to that brother and his descendants. If anybody knows, let us know. All right, interracial marriage. Laws prohibiting interracial marriage, known as anti-miscegenation laws, devalued black families. The earliest known anti-miscegenation law, passed in 1661 in the colony of Maryland, stated that a white woman who married a black man became an enslaved person. Wow. A white woman who married a black man became an enslaved person herself. Other colonies followed suit to prohibit interracial marriage during slavery. However, from slavery through the era of legal segregation, American society accepted white men having sex with black women, whether consensual or rape, especially when those women were treated as the property of white men. The children of these interracial interactions were typically enslaved and could not inherit their white father's wealth. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Let's do it. The children of these interracial interactions were typically enslaved and could not inherit their white father's wealth. Let's continue. Fears of interracial marriage often led to violence. In 1834, a false rumor that abolitionist ministers had married an interracial couple led to 11 days of racial terror in New York City. Mobs attacked a mixed-race gathering of the American Anti-Slavery Society and destroyed black churches, homes, schools, and businesses, as well as the homes and churches of leading abolitionists. A similar incident occurred in Philadelphia in 1838. Punishments for interracial marriage varied by state, but in many states prior to the Civil War, white Americans were punished more often than African Americans, at least within the legal system. Scholars have argued that this reflects anti-black racist attitudes that, depending on the circumstance, black people were sometimes considered too irresponsible and too inferior to punish, and it was whites' responsibility to protect the purity of their own bloodlines. Punishments for African Americans, however, were still severe, including whippings, fines, exile, or even enslavement if they were free at the time of their violation of the law. Although it is unclear how often anti-miscegenation laws were enforced, evidence suggests that they were used to make examples of high-visibility interracial couples who were considered a threat to public order. Parent-child relationships. Enslavement treated enslaved African Americans as replaceable property, so enslavers separated children from their parents if it was profitable to do so, and sometimes in order to discourage potential rebellion. This was justified by the enslavers in various ways. For example, Thomas R. Cobb, a legal scholar who drafted parts of the Georgia Legal Code of 1861, claimed that the black mother suffers little when her children are stolen from her, since she lacked maternal feelings. Cobb helped write principles of white supremacy into Georgia law, including a provision that presumed African Americans were enslaved unless proven otherwise. From their birth, enslaved children were considered property of the enslaver, and therefore enslavers controlled a child's life and upbringing. From the time of birth, enslavers stripped away parental rights, often not allowing the birth parents to choose the newborn's name. Very soon after giving birth, enslaved mothers were expected to return to work and leave their children with extended family members or an older enslaved woman who was assigned the role to watch over children on the plantation. Even if an enslaved parent had some control over their child's life, the enslaver held the highest authority and could make final decisions as to who would take care of the child, what activities they participated in, or whether they would be separated from their family by selling the parent or child to a different enslaver. As a result of many children and parents being separated through chattel sales, orphan children were often adopted and cared for by friends, extended family, or the enslaved community as a whole. This approach of allowing white strangers, aided by laws and government actors, to take a black child from their family is echoed after enslavement via the apprenticeship system and by the modern foster care system, as discussed further below. Enslaved children typically received no formal education and were expected to work as soon as they were physically able, forced to work in the fields as young as 8. They often worked in a similar capacity as the adults, working fields, tending animals, cleaning and serving in their enslavers' houses, and taking care of younger children. State law legally entitled enslavers to separate enslaved parents and children at any time, and to relocate them at different plantations at the time of the child's birth. Oh, man. In some southern states, approximately 1/3 of enslaved children were separated from one or both parents. Just quick interjection, I really wish that, freedmen specifically, but every American, if they care or not, really understood how enslavement has impacted the freedmen, the families. This is atrocious. This is really atrocious. All right, let's get back to it. Harriet Mason, an enslaved woman, Ashe, forced to separate from her family at age 7, related that she used to say, "I wish I died when I was little." Members of a family could be separately sold as enslavers, fell into debt, or wanted to raise profits. In some parts of the South, a black enslaved person had a 30% chance of being sold in his or her lifetime. A quarter of trades of enslaved persons across state lines destroyed a first marriage, while approximately half destroyed a nuclear family by separating immediate family members. Opponents of slavery, including those in the federal government, recognized how it destroyed the families of African Americans. Advocating for the elimination of slavery, U.S. Senator James Harlan of Iowa stated that slavery affected the abolition practically of the parental relation, robbing the offspring of the care and attention of his parents. Scholars argue that the anguish caused by the threat of family separation coerced enslaved people into working without complaint. The horrors of family separation during slavery were highlighted by abolitionists as a central strategy to enlist people to their cause. Near the end of slavery era in the 1850s, some southern states responded to public horror at child separation by passing laws prohibiting the taking of infants from their enslaved mothers. Modern scholars analyzing this development have argued that these laws were not passed out of concern for African Americans, but to assuage public outrage in order to maintain slavery. Extended family kinship structures. In order to cope with the destruction of their nuclear family, enslaved people created deep, extended, supportive relationships with other enslaved people. Some historians have argued that the extended kinship structures of black enslaved people married similar structures in their native West African homelands. Ashe. The role of black grandparents, other extended relatives, and older black caregivers who were not biologically related took on particular importance, with black grandmothers often serving as a central figure within a plantation, ensuring the care of all children of enslaved parents who were sold to other enslavers, killed, or otherwise removed from their nuclear families. The reliance of black mothers and African Americans on extended kinship networks was a necessity for mere survival, beginning in the slavery era and continued through legal segregation and other forms of discrimination. Every black historians argue that the legacy of slavery created disorganization and instability in black families for generations. In 1899 and again in 1909, prominent sociologist and social critic W. Du Bois published detailed, fact-driven analysis of black families, demonstrating the many ways in which a lack of economic means and opportunities after the end of slavery harmed black families in both the North and South. In 1932, sociologist E. Franklin Frazier argued that black families had particular difficulty adapting to the drastic changes of the early 20th century due to the way that enslavement destroyed black families and traditions. As discussed further below, these resulting harms have been used throughout American history to claim that the black family itself was to blame because it was dysfunctional by nature. Black families from emancipation to civil rights era 1865 to 1960. After slavery, states and private actors continued to discriminate against black families, particularly with respect to the dominant gender forms of the time. Before the women's liberation movement of the late 1960s redefined the role of women in society, women were expected to take care of children and the home. Only men were expected to participate in the public sphere. For black women, these expectations imposed impossible burdens. Black women were expected to be mothers and wives, but white society expected black women to be their servants and workers. Black women attempted to do both, which took a great emotional and physical toll on black women and in turn their families. For black men, traditional gender roles dictated that they must dominate and lead, acting as the head of the family. Under these norms of masculinity, society expected men to be stoic figures enduring all injury without emotion or complaint. These expectations too demanded the impossible from black men, as society expected them to accept the indignities of discrimination without complaint. When black men responded to discrimination in anger, one of the few emotions society expected of and allowed for men to exhibit, black men were criminalized and treated as threats, feeding the stereotypes imposed upon them. This, too, has taken a toll on black men and their families. Black parenthood. During this time, prevailing gender norms define fathers as breadwinners and mothers as caretakers at home. But racial discrimination combined with these gender expectations to place heavier burdens on black families and black parenthood. As described in greater detail in Chapter 10, stolen labor and hindered opportunity. Government and private actors discriminated against black men seeking employment, restricting them to ill-paid menial jobs and limiting their ability to earn income to support their families. At times, this required black men to direct their children to work to ensure that the family could survive. Black children, therefore, often could not pursue schooling or their own goals and dreams. Because discrimination limited black men's employment opportunities, black women also had to seek work to supplement the family's income, even where white women did not. This required black women to play the social roles of both men and women, taking care of children and the household while working jobs at the same time. The Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency established to aid the transition of enslaved people to freedom, singled out black women as a subset of poor women who were supposed to work rather than remaining at home. For example, South Carolina Freedmen's Bureau agent John DeForest criticized the myriads of black women who once earned their own living, who now have aspirations to be like white ladies, and instead of using the hoe, pass the days in dawdling over their trivial housework. As a result, a higher percentage of black married women worked than their white counterparts. This systemically denied black children the care of their mothers when compared to white children, whose mothers could often choose to stay home and provide care. Later in the 20th century, black women were generally precluded from taking public-facing retail jobs or professional secretarial work with the traditional 9-to-5 work schedules. Instead, typically, they were only given opportunities to serve as domestic caregivers and maids, often living in the homes of their white employers on call at all hours. Boom, interjection. We have a great example of this in our documentary. A great example of this right here in California. And we'll talk about it in that documentary, so go check it out when it comes out, family. All right, here we go. Continue. These domestic service jobs took the individual's work of caring and mothering from black families and gave it to the children of white families, often preventing black mothers from even living with their children. Interracial marriage. Anti-miscegenation laws continued after the end of enslavement when the 14th Amendment was ratified. It was not considered to prohibit laws banning interracial marriage so long as the laws applied equally to both races. In 1883, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of laws outlawing interracial marriage, and state courts followed suit through the mid-20th century. Members of Congress also tried unsuccessfully to ban interracial marriage nationwide through legislative proposals made in 1871, 1912, and 1928. Eventually, a total of 38 states established such laws. Many scholars argue that the white-dominated state governments passed anti-miscegenation laws to prevent African Americans, enslaved or otherwise, from accumulating wealth in addition to controlling women's sexuality. In America's earliest days, white colonists were also concerned with possibly mixing of African Americans and Native Americans, given that an alliance of both groups might provide sufficient strength to rise against slavery and other forms of economic oppression. The most direct concern was a passing on of white wealth to interracial offspring through inheritance or probate laws, undermining race-based social stratification. I'm going to repeat that. The most direct concern was a passing on of white wealth to interracial offspring through inheritance or probate laws, undermining race-based social stratification. So, interjection, my opinion, it's okay to impregnate black women, but you definitely don't want to give your offspring no money. Anyway, back to it. Children of legally unrecognized interracial marriages were almost always excluded from economic benefits they would have received if their parents were both white. The children were legally considered bastards and had no claim to the estates of their biological fathers, nor could the man or woman in such a void marriage claim alimony, child support, death benefits, or any inheritance. White relatives also had a strong motivation to ensure these statutes were strictly and aggressively enforced, since a sibling who might inherit nothing on the death of a married brother or sister could inherit that sibling's wealth by providing that the sibling spouse was black, and that the marriage was therefore void. Anti-miscegenation laws continue to deny economic benefits, especially in probate, i.e. judicial process, whereby a will is proven in court, to African Americans who would have otherwise received them, since by operation of law, assets of those who died without wills would be inherited by spouses. Government officials and white militants enforced bans on sexual intimacy between black men and white women with particular intensity due to the overlapping aims of maintaining racial hierarchy and policing white women's bodies. The Ku Klux Klan, an all-male group, claimed one of its purposes was to treat white women as the special objects of its regard and protection. Nevertheless, they abused, raped, and mutilated white women who fraternized with black men. This also meant that black men were special targets for violence after any interactions with white women. In Alabama in 1929, for example, Elijah Fields O'Shea, a 50-year-old black man, and Ollie Roden O'Shea, a 25-year-old white woman, were both arrested and tried for violation of the state's anti-miscegenation law, which prohibited cohabitation. An Alabama jury convicted Fields, even though Roden's father testified that he had only asked Fields to drive his daughter, who was incontinent and suffering from open sores, from a hospital to a boarding house. The state sentenced Fields to 2 to 3 years in prison, although it was later reversed on appeal. In 1967, in Loving versus Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court finally struck down all anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. All right, just kind of seeing where we're at here. All right, let's see. Okay. Continued enslavement of black children through an apprenticeship. The so-called apprenticeship system was a system that existed both before and after the Civil War, under which state and local governments, through court decisions and agency actions, removed black children from their families and placed them in the control of white adults, who sometimes forced them to work without pay. This system had existed in some form since late 1700s, including when enslavement of black children was legal. However, when during the slavery era, it was used to exploit the labor of free black children, including in enslaving states. For example, records reveal that in 1857, a 3-year-old free black boy named Charles Bell was bound to an apprenticeship in Frederick County, Maryland, until the age of 21, through an agreement between local county officials and Nathaniel C. Lupton, which makes no mention of his parents. Immediately after emancipation, former enslavers continued to exploit children both sexually and as a cheap source of labor through the apprenticeship system. Enslavers refused to free children when their parents were freed, either through apprenticeship laws or through outright kidnapping. Former enslavers petitioned state courts to remove black children for their families based on apprenticeship laws. These laws often allowed former enslavers to gain legal custody of black children simply by claiming their parents were incapable of financially supporting them. In addition to the trauma of losing a child, black families often suffered substantial economic harm since farming families relied upon children to assist in agricultural work. This apprenticeship system controlled black girls until they were 18 and black boys until they were 21. Although it is not known precisely how many children were effectively re-enslaved through apprenticeship, scholars estimate that many thousands of children in the South were taken from their recently freed parents. Court cases throughout the second half of the 19th century document occasionally successful attempts of parents to free their children from this form of enslavement, but also reveal the continued success of the system at ensuring that white former enslavers could profit from the continued exploitation of black children. Southern white people defended the apprenticeship system as benevolent in nature. One Maryland newspaper, for example, described the system in 1864 as being promoted by feelings of humanity towards these unfortunate young ones. One Texas judge described the Texas apprenticeship system as granting justice to these children by placing them in good, comfortable homes where they would receive some education. State and local courts were involved in empowering this injustice. So-called orphan courts across the southern states, typically run by pro-slavery judges, bound an estimated 10,000 children of free black men and women to these apprenticeships, which for all intents and purposes were an extension of their forced labor under slavery, operating to the benefit of the children's former enslavers. Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, noted in an 1860 case that under the Maryland apprenticeship system, younger persons were bound as apprentices, usually, if not always, to their late masters. This legal dispute arose because under Maryland law, anyone seeking to apprentice a white child was required to provide an education and could not involuntarily transfer the apprenticed child to another. However, black children subjected to apprenticeships were not provided similar rights and were described as a property and interest. In one well-known example, a young black girl named Elizabeth Turner, Ashe, was apprenticed as a house servant at the age of 8, 2 days after her emancipation. She challenged her apprenticeship because of the differences between apprenticeship laws for black and white children. The Supreme Court held that no black child could be bound to an apprenticeship without the protections afforded to white children, concluding that the alleged apprenticeship in the present case is involuntary servitude within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. Although this decision meant freedom for Elizabeth Turner, many Southern trial courts ignored Justice Chase's observations and the re-enslavement of black youth continued in the South. Since apprenticeships laws allowed local courts to judge whether black parents were financially able to raise their children, white former enslavers often easily convinced white judges that the children would be better off placed with them. Scholars have noted that these attitudes have continued through modern family court and child welfare systems, which continue to apply three presumptions that are racist in practice. 1. That the state knows how to raise black children better than their parents. 2. That poverty in and of itself prevents parents from raising their children well. And 3. That menial or vocational work instead of an academic education is more appropriate for black youth. During the New Deal, the federal government had a chance to remedy these abuses but did not. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, a federal law that generally outlawed child labor explicitly, carved out agricultural and domestic work, which was then largely done by black workers. The United States Congress excluded these industries from labor protections, thereby denying black children the labor protections given to white children. See Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, for further discussion of related issues. Impacts of the Great Migration on the Black Family. In the first half of the 20th century, millions of African Americans left the segregated South in search of greater opportunity in urban centers in the North and the West in a phenomenon called the Great Migration, which is discussed in detail in Chapter 1. This was in part because these cities already had some existing black social networks and possibly relatives with whom Southern African Americans could connect. Older studies theorize that black migrants during the Great Migration had disorganized family structures in the South, which they brought with them when they migrated to the North, contributing to higher rates of single parenthood and childbirth outside of marriage. Many black families sent one parent northwards or westwards first, with the rest of the family to follow months or years later. Modern scholarship disputed these conclusions, noting that black migrants from the South were more likely than African Americans already living in the North to have children living with two parents, married women living with their spouses, and fewer mothers that had never married. They were also less likely than Northern African Americans to receive welfare payments, contradicting claims in the Moynihan report, which is discussed further below, that the higher welfare payments in the North drew migrants from the South. California had an anti-miscegenation statute, even as other nearby states did not. In fact, California enacted an anti-miscegenation law in its very first legislative session in 1850. It initially singled out Negroes and mulattoes as the sole group which was prohibited from marrying whites. Following the national trend of disfranchising black people from entering into legally recognized marriages with white Americans. Although the law was based in slavery-era motivations for prohibiting such marriages, other racial groups facing waves of societal discrimination in California were targeted by later amendments to the original law. California legislators exported its ban on interracial marriage to other states. In 1939, California legislators convinced the Utah legislature to add Malay to their state's anti-miscegenation law in order to avoid having to recognize marriages between Filipino Americans and white people performed in Utah. It was not until 1948 that the California anti-miscegenation law was struck down by the California Supreme Court. Wow, 1948. At oral argument in defense of the law, the attorney for Los Angeles County asserted that it has been shown that the white race is superior physically and mentally to the black race, and the intermarriage of these races results in a lessening of physical vitality and mentality in their offspring, and that people who enter into misogynist marriages are usually from the lower walks of both races, generally people who are lost to shame. Even after the law was struck down as unconstitutional, the California legislature repeatedly refused to repeal the law. It was not until 11 years later that the California legislature finally repealed the statute following consistent pressure from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Moynihan Report. Few developments in the past century have been as impactful or arguably as harmful to Americans' perception of black families as the Moynihan Report of 1965. Drafting and content of the Moynihan Report. In the midst of the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, Daniel Moynihan, an Assistant Secretary of Labor researching policies as part of the Johnson administration's War on Poverty, drafted what was originally an internal Department of Labor report entitled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. As described in the introduction of the report, one of its goals was to analyze the African American family structure, which Moynihan saw as the fundamental problem underlying the gap in income, standards of living, and education between African Americans and other groups. The report described numerous ways that the historical legacy of slavery and institutional racism created lasting harmful effects on African Americans and the black family. However, while acknowledging the impacts of these historical realities, the report essentially claimed that the high rate of single motherhood in black families in America was a major reason for the continued failure of African Americans to achieve full and equal access to success in America. It further asserted that such equality could only be achieved by changing the culture of African Americans, and particularly of black men, who Moynihan claimed had been feminized and rendered inadequate workers through being raised without male role models. Even when advocating for governmental intervention to assist African Americans, the Moynihan Report still portrayed them as helpless, but for the intervention of white Americans, describing what Moynihan called the pathology of Black America as capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. Although the Moynihan Report relied heavily on scholarship previously published by black scholars and linked the poverty experienced by African Americans to the historical traumas of slavery, it also argued that the Civil Rights Act and equality of opportunity would not resolve them. Instead, the Moynihan Report asserted that the gap between the Negro and other groups in America's society is widening. The fundamental problem in which this is most clearly the case is that of family structure. Moynihan argued, for example, that the prevalence of single motherhood in black families created a matriarchal structure which seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole. The overt sexism and gender stereotyping of the report also dovetailed with existing hostility towards black women serving as leaders in the civil rights movement. Contemporary black women leaders were outraged that Moynihan explicitly advocated for improved governmental job opportunities for black men over black women to ensure male breadwinners. Trailblazing advocate Pauli Murray stated that Moynihan's criticism of black women in the workforce was bitterly ironic, as criticism for their efforts to overcome a handicap not of their own making. Murray and others sharply disputed that traditional gender roles could solve black poverty and racism. Social scientist Donna Franklin argued that the family instability Moynihan focused on was mostly a result of the fact that black women were hired as maids and child caregivers, while racial discrimination prevented black men from finding jobs. W. Du Bois made a similar observation nearly a half-century before the Moynihan Report. Franklin also noted that the many single mothers in the black community noted by Moynihan was at least partially due to the fact that adoption services did not accept black children. As a result, single black women were forced into motherhood when white women had the option of giving their children up for adoption. During the 1950s, 70% of white single mothers gave up their children for adoption, but only 5% of fewer of black single mothers did so. As Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, the report helped create the myth that fatherhood is a great antidote to all that ails black people. Ultimately, no national effort resulted from the Moynihan Report. President Johnson called for a White House conference in its wake, which occurred in November of 1965. At that point, the report had engendered so much controversy that Moynihan himself was largely sidelined at the conference, having recently left the administration. Let's see where we at. All right. The contemporary response of black leaders to the Moynihan Report. Largely in response to the Moynihan Report, President Johnson acknowledged the legacy of state-sanctioned slavery and discrimination when he publicly stated, "Negro poverty is not white poverty." Nevertheless, his administration followed that announcement with few meaningful efforts to address disparities of African Americans. Johnson did, however, convene a group of well-respected civil rights leaders to address black poverty, which produced a report proposing that the federal government spend billions of dollars to ensure jobs, universal health insurance, and a basic minimum income paid to all Americans, regardless of race. Okay, interjection. So there was nothing specific done for black folk. Let's continue. Their approach did not acknowledge that the American government has harmed African Americans in a unique way, since they believe proposals aimed at helping all poor Americans, black and white, were likely to succeed. Nevertheless, very few of the recommendations ultimately manifested in any federal legislation from the Johnson administration or otherwise. Impacts on public discourse and social. Let's see where we're at here real quick. Okay. One. Okay. All right, here we go. Impacts on public discourse and social policy. Scholars have constantly criticized the Moynihan Report for blaming the victim. For some politicians and government actors, the Moynihan Report justified a stance that African Americans were unworthy of public assistance because black culture was to blame for harms resulting from enslavement and racial discrimination. Moynihan also suggested that every young black man should join the armed forces, which would provide black men with a much-needed world away from women, a world run by strong men of unquestioned authority, where discipline, if harsh, is nonetheless orderly and predictable. This recommendation was made as American involvement in the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate, at a time in which black men were underrepresented in the armed forces. Moynihan's analysis and recommendation led to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's Project 100,000, a program ostensibly designed to allow greater access to the U.S. military for those who initially failed the qualifications test. Project 100,000 ultimately served as a successful recruitment tool for black soldiers in the Vietnam War. 40% of those recruited were black, a proportion nearly 4 times the percent of African Americans in the general population. Regardless, black men were more likely to be drafted than white men, further devastating black families when thousands of black men died in the war. Although the Moynihan Report and its central conclusions were immediately controversial and contested, President Johnson adopted its language and central focus in decrying the breakdown of the Negro family structure as fundamental to the challenges faced by African Americans. Several high-profile scholars also used the conclusions of the Moynihan Report to argue against the very social welfare programs for which Moynihan had advocated to help African Americans out of poverty. These included Arthur Jensen and Charles Murray, best known for their deeply controversial book, The Bell Curve, who argued that the wealth gap between black and white Americans existed because white Americans were more intelligent, a position Moynihan explicitly rejected. Later, scholars argued the Moynihan Report provided grounds for politicians to blame black single-parent families for their poverty and to deny assistance to African Americans in need. Scholars have noted that Ronald Reagan, as California governor, exploited the perception of the single black mother popularized by the Moynihan Report when he coined the term welfare queen. Boom. I'm glad that they talked about it. I think I previously mentioned this earlier before we went on. Anyway, let's continue. As part of his larger campaign for limited government, historians have argued that the Moynihan Report, despite arguing for greater interventions to combat black poverty, nevertheless influenced the political movement within the federal government in the 1990s to cut welfare programs and impose punitive welfare to work, training, or employment requirements on recipients of cash assistance. Man, this is just crazy. All right, I'm gonna change it on the 1s and 2s. Get back to it. The welfare system, assistance to families. Despite the consistent arguments of politicians in 1980s and 1990s, stereotyping African Americans as unfairly taking advantage of government welfare policies, the American welfare system throughout history has actually discriminated against black women and families both explicitly and implicitly. 1900 to 1935, state mothers' pensions. States across America developed centralized welfare systems in the early 1900s to provide economic aid to low-income single mothers taking care of their children. States made support payments every month to ensure a basic standard of living to care for both mother and child. By 1930, all but 2 of the 48 existing states had created these mothers' pensions. Throughout the era of mothers' pensions, Southern states consistently avoided giving aid to single black mothers. These policies discriminated against black mothers despite their greater economic need on average. This approach was in line with Southern state officials' administration of federal public works programs. Such officials generally argue that African Americans should not need or be given relief so long as menial jobs were available to them. Research has shown that between 1910 and 1920, the states in the South that enacted no mothers' pensions were those with greatest percentage of black single mothers. Similarly, states that had higher black single motherhood rates were slower to enact such pensions and or less generous with them when they were enacted. Both northern and southern states also implemented standards and disproportionately disqualified black women, such as barring unmarried mothers from receiving benefits. Many states across the nation only gave mothers pensions to widows, thereby excluding unmarried mothers who were more often black women. Even nominally race-neutral programs were often racist in their administration, since discretion in administering these programs was often left to line officials, judges, as well as county agencies, who made decisions to separate the worthy mothers from the unworthy and about whether to provide benefits at all. A welfare field supervisor in the 1930s explained that the withholding of the welfare payments from black mothers was to prevent them from staying at home, caring for their children, and to instead force them into workplace. This reflected the attitude of the white community that black women should be forced to continue engaging in seasonal labor jobs or domestic service rather than receive any aid. A survey of all mothers' pensions across states in 1931 found that 90% of recipients were white. Only 3% went to black mothers. I'm going to repeat that. A survey of all mothers' pensions across states in 1931 found that 96% of recipients were white. Only 3% went to black mothers. All the states of the Deep South, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, created mothers' pension programs, but provided almost no assistance to black single mothers. Across these 7 states in 1931, only 39 black families received mothers' pensions compared to 2,957 white families. In 1935 to the present, federal aid to dependent children and modern welfare. In 1935, the federal government passed the Social Security Act, which created a federal program similar to the state mothers' pensions known as Aid to Dependent Children, later renamed Aid to Families with Dependent Children. In the 1950s, the federal government established payment programs to help poor Americans, but these programs were administered by state government agents who often denied welfare benefits to black families by claiming that their homes were immoral, typically because children were born out of wedlock. For example, in 1960, the Louisiana government removed 23,000 children from its state welfare rolls solely because their parents were not married, which was more likely to be the case among black families. In response, the federal government prohibited states from denying welfare benefits solely because the child was born to unmarried parents, and required them to decide on a case-by-case basis whether a family was unsuitable for welfare and to provide service interventions to such families. Although the intent of this rule, which became known as Fleming Rule, was to prohibit states from excluding families from welfare assistance by applying broad and often arbitrary rules to all recipients. The effect was to push more black children into foster care. State welfare officials investigated black families to consider whether to remove their children, often simply because the family was poor. Again, scholars have noted that these policies were in many ways a modern-day continuation of the apprenticeship programs of removing black children from their low-income families. For example, in 1960 in Florida, the largely state welfare workers staff investigated and challenged the suitability of approximately 13,000 families already receiving welfare assistance. Of these 13,000 families, only 9% were white. even though welfare recipients as a whole were 39% white. The state of Florida forced these 13,000 families to choose between their children or their welfare benefits. Wow. Based on the racist beliefs that black women had little maternal connection to their children, state workers expressed surprise that only 168 families agreed to place their children in state care. In modern times, the welfare system of cash assistance has remained biased against African Americans. In 1996, as part of a public movement against so-called welfare moms, Congress passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which created the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families Program, a system of federal funds sent to the states. This system awards fixed dollar amounts to each state, but allows them to spend that money how they see fit to achieve federal goals. These goals include, but are not limited to, providing cash assistance to needy families and ending the dependence of needy parents on government benefits. The system has allowed states to craft policies that determine who is eligible for assistance, and these state policies tend to disqualify black families from receiving cash assistance at a higher rate than any other racial and ethnic groups. For example, 7 states have policies that completely ban individuals with any drug-related convictions from eligibility for cash assistance. As discussed in Chapter 11, in an unjust and equal system, black families, individuals are much more likely than white family individuals to be convicted of drug offenses due to discrimination in the criminal justice system. Therefore, these restrictions are more likely to burden poor African Americans. Similarly, 11 states still maintain family cap policies that originated in welfare mom stereotypes, which deny benefit increases when welfare recipients have another child, and have disproportionate impacts on black families that tend to be larger than white families. One other notable change has emerged in very recent times because the law gives states the power to spend federal money on programs other than direct cash assistance. States are motivated to minimize cash assistance so they can spend more on other programs that might otherwise drain state coffers. Over the past 20 years, there has been a dramatic reduction in the percentage of federal money spent on cash assistance. In 1997, 71% of federal money was spent on welfare benefits nationwide, whereas in 2019, states spent only 21% of their federal money on such benefits. Again, African Americans are more likely to suffer from this change, as states with larger percentages of black residents have tended to spend the least percentage of the federal funds on welfare benefits. All right, let's see where we're at, family. That's 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. California. Historically, California provided mothers' pensions solely to widows, and was thus more likely to give these benefits to white single mothers because of the greater percentage of unwed black mothers. Moreover, the racist stereotypes of welfare queen was arguably popularized by then California Governor Ronald Reagan in 1976, who ran for president in part on a promise to cut welfare benefits as he had done as governor of California. Currently, California spends a greater percentage of its federal temporary assistance to needy families funds on basic assistance than most other states in the nation. However, that percentage has reduced from 51% in 2009 to 39% in 2020. Advocates and academics note that these reductions disproportionately harm black families. All right, family. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. I'm actually going to push through this because we got about 7 or 8 more pages. If you want to stay with us, please do. I'm gonna try to get us out of here by 10:30. Might push it to 10:45. I know I might be late for some of y'all because we all got work, I think. But if you want to continue, we will do that. Just give me a quick minute, family, and I will be right back. All right, fam, we back. We're back once again. I guess the second part of this read. I'm going to continue. May the ancestors be with us as we stand on the shoulders of giants. And as the future generations hopefully stand on our shoulders and continue the path that we have set for them. But we trying to see them reparations today before we pass on. So this is part of the work though, family, so we can get prepared, right? So we have some knowledge, wisdom, and information, so we know where we've come from, where we're headed, and where we're going. All right. Had to get some more energy back in there. All right, may the ancestors be with us. All right, here we go. Foster care systems and other forms of child welfare. Historically and through today, Black families have faced racism in the child welfare system. After the Civil War, government agencies excluded Black orphans from government care and have consistently been more likely to investigate Black families. As of 2019, Black children accounted for roughly 14% of child population, but 23% of the foster care population. The fact that child welfare agencies are more likely to investigate Black families is not because Black parents are more likely to mistreat their children, but rather due to many other factors. 237 factors. 237, an official study of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services found in 1996 that disproportionately of Black children being taken from their parents and placed in foster care does not derive from inherent differences in the rates at which they are abused or neglected, but rather reflects the differential attention received by Black children along the child welfare service pathway. Since then, some studies have found slightly higher rates of mistreatment within Black families, but scholars have observed that these higher rates are due to the fact that black families are more likely to be poor, and the stresses of poverty correlate with child mistreatment, foster care, and adoption throughout American history. Both during and for many decades after the slavery era, black children were systemically excluded from orphanages and other resources designed to care for poor children. Instead, some free black children were placed in charitable housing for unhoused or very low-income adults. Let's see where we're at. Where they faced abuse and were sometimes indentured into forced labor, effectively re-enslaving them. Non-governmental black child welfare organizations were sometimes established to help some black children rejected from private and public entities that only assisted white children. For example, Pittsburgh's Home for Colored Children was founded after a young black girl, Neely Grant, wandered the streets after being rejected from the city's child care institutions because she was black. Scholars have argued that more black children end up in foster care because adoption services believe that black children were unadoptable due to the preferences of the white families which they serve to adopt white children. After governmental child adoption services were officially open to black children, most were not still given the same opportunities as white families because adoption agencies cater to the preferences of white families. Non-governmental agencies similarly excluded black children by catering to the private adoption market, which was largely affluent and white. When these adoption institutions failed to place black children with families, they blamed the children and stigmatized them as unadoptable. Okay, pause. I think maybe we also need to include foster care and adoption agencies within the Freedmen Bureau as well, because we definitely don't want our babies to get abused. All right, here we go. State government systems that take children from caregivers believed to be unfit and place them in other environments designed to ensure their safety developed after World War II. From the start, state agencies removed black children from their families and placed them into foster care far more often than white children. Between the years of 1945 and 1961, the number of non-white children in child welfare caseloads almost doubled, increasing from 14% to 27%. As the modern foster care system developed, various governmental policies have placed black youth at greater risk of being taken from their families. As discussed above, until the 1950s, poor black families continued to be denied benefits available to poor Americans based on federal policies, and then were faced with potential removal of their children into foster care because of unsuitable home conditions. The criminalization of African Americans through the war on drugs also contributed to increasing numbers of black children being removed from families and placed in the foster care system, as black men in particular were disproportionately arrested for minor crimes, breaking apart families and often leaving children in the care of extended relatives or strangers. Facts. Children welfare agencies tasked with ensuring child safety often pay particular attention to families experiencing homelessness and housing instability, which African Americans are more likely to experience. Housing instability can also deny the return of a child who has been removed to their family. From 1945 to 1982, the percentage of non-white children in foster care rose from 17% to 47%, with 80% of non-white children being black. Scholars have found that racial discrimination exists at every stage of the child welfare process. State agencies are more likely to be involved with black families than with white families. Black parents are more likely to be investigated than other families because neighbors, teachers, and bystanders are more likely to report black families than white families, likely due to their own racial biases. When equally poor black and white families are compared, even where the families are considered to be at equal risk for future abuse, state agencies are more likely to remove black than white children from their families. A 2008 study found that black children were 77% more likely than similarly situated white children to be removed from their homes as opposed to receiving in-home services. Black children placed in foster care spend more time there and are less likely to reunify with their families. All other factors being equal, black parents are more likely than white parents to have their parental rights terminated. Interjection. Definitely need this to have this Freedmen's Bureau, to have a family department, because this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. All right, in 2017, the New York Times published evidence of racist foster care interventions in New York City, in which black mothers not only had their children taken away, but also faced unfair criminal consequences. One black woman, who remained anonymous in the article, called emergency services when she went into premature labor, but then realized her boyfriend could not be reached unless she walked to his location. She left her 6-year-old daughter alone at her apartment and walked to get her boyfriend, returning 40 minutes later to find emergency services and police. Immediately giving birth, she was handcuffed and placed. I don't even feel like going on with this. Immediately after giving birth, she was handcuffed and placed under arrest for child endangerment, and both of her children, including her newborn baby, were... Man, I gotta pause on this, yo. Immediately after giving birth, she was handcuffed and placed under arrest for her child, both her children, including her newborn baby? Who does that? Were placed in foster care. Scholars argue that the refusal of some black academics to consider the narrative experiences of black parents facing foster care interventions such as these echo the arguments of the Moynihan Report. Consequences of foster care disparities. As a group, children in the foster care system are often subjected to harms as a result of this experience, or the experience. These children are more likely to be black. For example, Brittany Clark spent 12 years in state care. At age 7, she was placed as the only girl in a long-term home, during which she experienced physical and sexual abuse. After 5 years, Clark was relocated and spent the remainder of her time in foster care, moving from home to home, encountering individuals who cared more about receiving foster care payments than caring for her. This instability, lack of control over circumstances, and repeated loss of connection harms foster children in compounding and lasting ways. Foster children as a group, in which black children are greatly overrepresented, demonstrate various long-term negative outcomes when compared to children not involved in the foster care system. Compared to youth nationally, children who age out of foster care are less likely to be employed regularly and earn far less than young adults who are not in the foster care system. By age 26, only 3 to 4% of young adults who aged out of foster care earn a college degree. 1 in 5 of these youth will experience homelessness after turning 18. Only half will obtain any employment by 24. Over 70% of female foster youth will become pregnant by 21, and 1 in 4 former foster youth will experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Children in foster care are also more likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. Some children taken from their families are placed in correctional facilities, and within this group, black children were placed in various penal facilities at rates much higher than white children. Approximately 25% of children in foster care will become involved with the criminal justice service system within 2 years of leaving foster care, and over half of youth currently in foster care experience an arrest, conviction, or stay at a correctional facility by the age of 17. For children who have been moved through multiple foster care placements, the risk is even higher, with one study indicating that over 90% of foster youth who move 5 or more times will end up in the juvenile justice system. Foster youth, particularly girls, are targeted by sex traffickers, and the criminalization of sex work can funnel these victims of modern-day slavery into the criminal justice system. As a result, these severe disadvantages faced by foster youth, some modern scholars have advocated for the abolition of the modern Child Protective Services Agency, arguing that it is inherently racist and should be replaced with a child protection model that implements policies and procedures designed from the ground up to exclude racist presumptions. California's child welfare system historically exhibited and continues to exhibit the same disparities between Black and white families that are discussed above at the national level, generally in even more extreme forms. For example, Black children in California make up approximately 22% of the foster population, while only 6% of the general child population. Nationally, these percentages are 24% and 15%, meaning that in California, Black children are more than twice as overrepresented in foster care when compared to the national average. A 2015 study ranked California among the 5 worst states in foster care racial disparities. Some counties in California, both urban and rural, have much higher disparities compared to the statewide average. In San Francisco County, which is largely urban and has nearly 900,000 residents, the percentage of Black children in foster care in 2018 was over 25 times the rate of white children. In Yolo County, which is largely rural and has approximately 200,000 residents, the percentage of Black children in foster care in 2018 was over 8 times the rate of white children. In 2014, Los Angeles County's Commission on Child Protection issued a detailed report noting widespread failures and shortcomings across the county's child welfare system, failures that fall disproportionately on the overrepresented Black population within that system. Similar to national statistics, a 2003 study showed that even when normalizing for other relevant factors like poverty, Black children in California are more likely to be removed from their caretakers and placed in foster care than white children. Black children in California are approximately twice as likely as white children to experience a child protective services investigation and approximately 3 times as likely to spend some time in foster care or experience a termination in parental rights. California youth who enter foster care also consistently exhibit various achievement gaps compared to children not involved with foster care, further worsening disparities for African Americans. By age 24, California foster youth who age out of foster care earn less than half what an average 24-year-old earns nationally. Only 53% of foster youth in California graduate high school in time, compared with 83% of all youth in California. California has made some recent attempts to address these dramatic disparities between foster youth and those not in the foster system, though little has been done to specifically target the racial disparities discussed above. In September 2021, California Assembly Bill 12 was passed into law, enabling foster youth to remain in care through age 21 as a tool to help increase foster youth college attendance rates and address some of the negative consequences of youth aging out of care at 18 with no sources of support. Okay, I'm gonna put that in the chat. California bill, was it 12? Yeah, 12. Okay. In July 2021, California lawmakers approved the first ever state-funded plan to guarantee monthly cash payments to youth leaving the foster system. All University of California, California State University, and California community college campuses now have foster youth programs designed to provide help and support to former foster youth on their campuses, explicitly addressing the racial disparity in Los Angeles County's foster care system. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors created an Office of Equity within the agency administering the foster care system. It was created, however, with no proposed budget or more specific mandates on the office in terms of actual services it will provide. All right, just really quick pause. Definitely, I know we talked about the education, but we have to, I think it's only mandatory that we have schools that are dedicated specifically for freedmen, K through 12, undergraduate and graduate, right here in California. All right, I know there's Charles Drew down in Los Angeles, I believe, or at least in Southern California. I know that's an HBCU down there, but we need more. We need a lot more, because our children, our youth need specific attention. We need to give our children, our youth, specific tutelage, right? Because we have specific harms that have been done to us. And we have some very brilliant youth out there that, because of the past of America, haven't been given the same opportunities that others have. I'm off my soapbox. Interjection is done. Let's continue. Criminalization of Black youth. Black youth are more likely to be exposed to the criminal legal system as a result of racism and over-policing. In recent years, these disparities have often gotten worse. In 2018, while Black youth made up 16% of the youth population, the rate of arrests of Black youth was 2.6 times that of white youth, and Black youth accounted for 50% of all youth arrests for violent crimes. Once charged with a crime, Black youth are at risk of harsher prosecution, detention, and punishment. Black youth are transferred to adult court at a much higher rate than white youth. In 2018, while Black youth only accounted for 35% of all cases, they made up more than 51% of transfers from the juvenile court system to adult court. Black girls are 3.5 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white peers. Black girls also comprise 34% of girls in residential placements, but accounted for 15% of the female youth population. A 2016 study found that for youth serving life without parole sentences in the United States, twice as many individuals were Black as white. Law enforcement and other government agencies across America often treat Black youth as adults, or as less than human in myriad ways. Research confirms that law enforcement often overestimates the age of Black youth when they are suspected of a felony based on contact with police. One study found that Black boys are perceived as older than they are and less innocent than their white peers. School policing. In all 50 states, public schools, including elementary schools, employ student resource officers, which often do not go by the title of police. Proponents of school policing have long tied this practice to fears after deadly mass shootings in places like Columbine High School. While some scholars have argued its prevalence is linked to white fear of Black youth under the guise of protecting school children, in either case, over the past several decades, the number of law enforcement officers on school campuses throughout the United States has skyrocketed. I mean, it's interjection. It's interesting how it's skyrocketed, but we have, quote unquote, I don't know what they were doing down in Texas. Where was the security at that time? Interjection: while they're over policing, black kids, in school and not doing their jobs to protect their communities from mass shooters who are majority non-white or who are white. In particular, these mass shootings of schools, killing young, innocent children, teachers. Let's continue. In 1975, the number of U.S. schools with police presence on campus was only 1%. By 2016, there were 27,000 school resource officers patrolling U.S. schools, up from about 19,400 in 1997. All right, family, I'm going to take a quick break. We are almost done, and I will be right back. Thanks for hanging in there. I'll be right back. All right, fam, let's go. See where we're at. By 2016, there were 27,000 school resource officers patrolling U.S. schools, up from about 9,400 in 1997. This equated to sworn officers in approximately 36% of elementary schools, 67.6% of middle schools, and 72% of high schools in the 2017-2018 school year. This is at least partially due to a dramatic increase in federal funding for school police. Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act in 1994 to increase federal involvement in school policing and safety. The law provided massive federal aid for policing at the state and local level and in schools. In the 2015-2016 school year, Black students were arrested at 3 times the rate of white students, while only compromising 15% of the population in schools. This disparity widens for Black girls, who make up 17% of the school population, but are arrested at 3.3 times the rate of white girls. This is at least partially explained by findings that Black girls are seen by authorities and teachers as disobedient and disruptive for similar but accepted behaviors from white children. I can't remember, quick interjection. There's a really good documentary, and I just can't remember what it's called, but it's about the young Black woman who got dragged in, I think she was somewhere down the South. I could be wrong. I want to say it was somewhere down the South, maybe. Give or take, or was it St. Louis? Anyway, I can't remember. But anyway, if y'all can remember what that documentary is called, go check it out. And if you can't remember the incident, I'll briefly tell you, it was this young Black woman who was in school, and I guess she had some altercation with her teacher, and her teacher ended up calling this white dude, security officer from the school. Anyway, he ended up dragging her from her desk, and it just got all hectic and crazy. So anyway, I think, was it what is Stars? I think Stars may have done that I think it was Stars. Yeah, I think it was Stars. Anyway, it's a really good documentary. It just goes behind the scenes because I know the clip went viral and there was just a lot of back and forth, but you know, the young sister was actually able to tell her side of the story. And as a matter of fact, the white security officer actually told his story too at the same time. So you got both perspectives. But anyway, it's a systemic issue that's plaguing this society, and you know, I would argue that this definitely goes back to enslavement. You know. Anyway, let's continue. Moreover, schools have historically disciplined clothing trends popular among Black youth, including sagging, oversized, and baggy clothes. Police played a role in creating a narrative in schools that sagging was a symbol of gang activity, and school officials proceeding to ban sagging as a way to prevent gang violence, graffiti, and create safe environments for kids, thereby further targeting Black youth. See Chapter 6, Separate and Unequal Education, for more information on the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. Okay, real quick interjection. The days that I grew up, and maybe some of y'all not grew up during the 80s in high school. Yeah, I remember it was crazy because, you know, the Bloods and the Crips, I mean, it was just, I know especially out here in California, it was hot. I mean, I don't know anybody that didn't know somebody who unfortunately got either jailed, prisoned, or murdered off that gang stuff during that time. But like a lot of people, I mean, even if you weren't affiliated with the gang, you couldn't even like wear that. You know, you couldn't wear any clothing related to red or blue, or you would get targeted. I mean, it was just nuts. And also the movie Colors did not help at all. I mean, that movie was atrocious, first of all, to the Black community. I mean, oh my gosh, that movie was, oh my gosh, I just remember seeing that, and it was just insane. Anyway, let's get back into it. 1 in 5 students in the U.S. will develop mental health challenges that rise to the level of a diagnosis. Yet around the country, schools are more likely to employ law enforcement than mental health counselors, and Black students are 3 times more likely than their white peers to have police in their school, but no psychologists. Black male youth with disabilities in the 2015-2000 school year had an arrest rate of 5 times the rate of the whole population. All right, family, we are getting down to the nitty gritty. We're almost there. Got a couple more pages. Thank y'all for hanging in there with us. We gonna make it happen, fam. We're gonna make it happen. All right, the juvenile justice system. Outside of schools, Black youth face disproportionate harms through various aspects of the juvenile justice system. A 2021 study by researchers from the University of California, Berkeley, found that Black youth in the 10 to 14 age group are injured in police-related incidents at 5.3 times the rate for boys and 6.7 times the rate for girls compared to their white peers. The study suggested that, especially among Black girls, this disparity could be due to how Black girls are adultified compared to white girls and perceived of as older. Scholars have noted similar adultification of Black boys who at 10 years old are perceived as less childlike, less innocent, and 4.5 years older than their white counterparts. Because of this perception of Black children as older and less innocent, they are seen as more responsible for their actions than white children who engage in the same behaviors. Both Black boys and girls are also perceived as more dangerous than their white peers, though the magnitude of the bias has been shown to be stronger for boys than girls. More broadly, as discussed in Chapter 11, an unjust legal system of this report, African American youth are more than 4 times as likely to be detained or committed in juvenile facilities as their white peers. Youth who are stopped more frequently by police are more likely to report feelings such as anger, fear, and stigma and shame. More invasive stops led to increased feelings of emotional distress and trauma, including post-traumatic stress after the stop. Stress among youth involved in police stops is not contingent on whether they were engaging in any misconduct. The war on drugs in the 1980s and 90s had an outside impact on Black youth. White youth use drugs at the same or higher rate as Black youth, but Black youth are disproportionately prosecuted through drug cases in juvenile courts. Again, this was largely enabled by the federal government. In 1990, Congress passed legislation authorizing Department of Defense resources to be used to combat drug activity by state and local agencies, including public schools. In 2014, schools in states such as California, Florida, and Texas reported receiving military-grade equipment through the department's program. Wow. Black youth facing mental health problems or crises are also funneled into the juvenile justice system in ways white children facing similar issues are not. Even when Black youth receive mental health treatment instead of or in addition to incarceration, they are more likely to be inappropriately diagnosed and medicated than their white peers. Once in the juvenile justice system, outreach to families is inadequate. Police and faculty outreach to parents is usually limited to notice that their child has an upcoming court appearance, without more information such as why an arrest was made or the circumstances of their child's confinement. The bail system for youth in the criminal legal system is also deeply flawed. Courts rarely consider what a family can actually afford when setting bail, and bail is regularly set between $100 to $500 for children. Wow. The issues discussed above apply to California's history and present treatment of Black youth, although there has been some modern pushback to these approaches. Recent California Attorney General investigations of settlements with California school districts, for example, the Barstow Unified School District, the Oroville City Elementary School District, and the Oroville Union High School District are all representative of continued targeting of Black youth. Investigations of these districts show that Black students were more likely to be punished and or suspended and were subjected to greater punishments than similarly situated peers of other races. Other districts have taken proactive steps to change outdated approaches. For example, the Oakland School Board voted to remove security officers from schools in June 2020. Before this vote, school officer practices were governed by a policy and procedure manual that described them as having a calming presence in the school. The manual also included authorization for officers to restrain students, search students and their property, and even detain individuals if they had reason to believe a crime had been committed. All of these powers and the school police enforcing them have disproportionate harmful impacts on Black students. California-specific research has determined that schools with larger police presences? That's police presence, anyway. Lead to decreased instruction for Black students, likely because police discipline and monitoring contributes to a climate that is incompatible with learning. Nonetheless, California still allows law enforcement discretion to add youth over the age of 12 to a gang database as long as 2 of the following factors under certain limitations and requirements are found: admission of gang activity, identification of a gang tattoo, frequent identification in a gang area, any known association with gang members, clothing associated with the gang, arrest for typical gang activity, or display of gang signals. In California, public defenders and youth advocates estimate that police have tracked children as young as 10 for suspected gang activity. In one high-profile incident related to the policing of black children, in May 2019, police in Sacramento chased down a black 12-year-old child who they claim was asking police to buy goods as he was selling, and forcefully detained him while he was calling for his mom. One police officer, shout out to Sacramento, go figure. One police officer covered his face with a mesh sack and forced him on the ground with a knee on his back while an officer put a knee on his thigh. Domestic violence in black families. Domestic violence, also termed intimate partner violence, is a significant problem within black families and communities across the country, and that problem is linked to many of the issues already discussed in this chapter. Elevated rates of domestic violence. Black women experience intimate partner violence at greater rates and in more traumatic ways than other women on average. The U.S. Department of Justice estimated that in 2000, black families experienced intimate partner violence at a rate 35% higher than that of white women. In 2007, data indicated that black women victims of intimate partner violence were twice as likely to be murdered by a spouse and 4 times as likely to be murdered by an unmarried partner when compared to white women. Even among victims of intimate partner violence, black women experience more traumatic forms of violence on average as compared to white women. Moreover, black men also experience elevated rates of intimate partner violence when compared to white men. Similar patterns exist for black LGBTQ plus victims of both genders who experience intimate partner violence at greater rates than white LGBTQ victims. Despite these disparities, very little academic or practical attention has been paid towards specific interventions or assistance models that are explicitly catered to black victims. Causal factors. The higher rates of domestic violence in black families cannot be explained by a single cause. Some scholars have noted that aside from greater rates of poverty, overcrowding, and other domestic violence risk factors experienced by black families, black men have experienced systemic racism throughout American history that, when compounded with traditional gender roles, may contribute to displaced anger, hatred, and frustration toward family members. Throughout American history, black men have been subjected to racial discrimination in employment, as further detailed in Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, while society simultaneously tells them that their role is to provide for their families. Scholars have argued that these pressures, which are impossible to reconcile, may lead to expressions of physical violence. Regardless of the causes of domestic violence, black women are less likely to seek assistance from social services agencies because of distress based on the racially discriminatory history described earlier in this chapter. Evidence shows that this distrust, not misplaced, government actors in social services agencies and the judicial system have unfairly disregarded black victims as angry welfare queens who are immune to violence or violent themselves. These perceptions are further cemented by media portrayals of black women as aggressive or emasculating. Similarly, black women already involved within the justice system are less likely to seek help from police because they expect to be disbelieved. Based on the extensive histories of racist government actions in supporting violence against black women, as detailed in chapters 3, Racial Terror, 11, An Unjust Legal System, and 12, Harm and Neglect, Mental, Physical, and Public Health. Black female victims of abuse are sometimes reluctant to report abuse by black men to the white legal system, even when police intervention is appropriate, given their long exposure to inequities within that system for African Americans. As explained by Cecily Johnson, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Domestic Violence Network, I have been told personally by a survivor that they can't get help because they don't want their partner to become a statistic. There's a genuine and legitimate fear that if they call the police, their partner could be killed, or they, as the survivor, could be killed. Black transgender women are similarly hesitant to report abuse to the police because they fear being falsely or illegitimately arrested, are particularly likely to be physically or sexually assaulted in prison, and because they are more than 3 times as likely to experience police violence compared to non-transgender people. High-profile instances of violence against transgender women, especially when transgender women defend themselves, legitimize these fears. A lack of understanding of the real and well-founded concerns of Black victims of domestic violence and the distrust of Black victims of police and social services has consistently been a major challenge among those tasked with helping victims of intimate partner violence, both within California and nationally. Well, I think that can definitely be, at least as far as before we finish up here, especially within the Freedmen's Bureau, kind of dealing with that domestic relationship issues, maybe some kind of mental health, psychologist department or something like that, to help out with all this other stuff. Maybe a mediation service of some sort. California. Let's continue. California. The patterns discussed above exist in California as well as nationally. California has the largest number of domestic violence survivors in the country, and Black women in California are approximately 25% more likely than women generally to experience such violence during their lifetimes. Moreover, a report from Blue Shield of California concluded that Black women in particular experience a significant resource gap after instances of intimate partner violence. These disparities have likely been exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic, with significant majorities of Black Californians surveyed saying that they believe the epidemic and its stay-at-home orders both made domestic violence more likely to occur and made it harder for victims of such violence to reach out for help. Qualitative studies within California have also confirmed that Black Californians perceive poverty, prior trauma, and systemic racism as root causes of domestic violence in Black families. All right, I'm going to post that in there. Black female victims in California are also less likely to seek police assistance because they fear police will falsely believe them to be aggressors and arrest them as well. The destruction, commodification, and exploitation of the Black family has occurred throughout American history and enriched both private and government actors for generations of white Americans. The racist and sexist stereotypes created during enslavement to sustain the cotton economy and enrich the entire nation are woven throughout American laws, policies, and government agencies. These racist beliefs tore apart Black families on the auction block during enslavement, justified re-enslaving children through the apprenticeship system, and underlie the continued removal of Black children from their parents in the foster care system. This reality has rarely been recognized, let alone remedied. To the contrary, in the past half-century, government actors have blamed African Americans for their harms that have resulted from racist government actions. Whew. All right, the ancestors was with us on that one, family. Whoa, made it through that one. All right, so I'm just scrolling down to see what next chapter. All right, chapter 9, control over creative and cultural and intellectual life. Ain't that the truth? Yeah, I'm not going to assume anything. But this is obviously down, my path, being in the media world and so forth. And so this is going to be, an interesting take on it. If y'all haven't seen on our channel Blacklisted yet, check it out. We actually go into some of the history of specifically the film industry and how, and they talk about it in this report too, but we take it a little further in Blacklisted. So let's see what's going on here. All right, Tamir Rice. Never forget, he was only 12. Facts. Oh, they have an article, huh? Read the article. Oh, shout out. Thanks, Darlene, for that link. All right. I guess we were talked about somewhere. Man, Theo, what's up, fam? How you doing? Appreciate you. Great job, Walt. Man, like, we're only as good as the people that we're surrounded by, right? So appreciate you, brother. Appreciate you coming through as always. All right, fam, on that wonderful note, as usual, have a great evening. We will continue with Chapter 9, Control Over Creative, Cultural, and Intellectual Life, tomorrow at 8:30 in the building. As usual, love, peace, reparations. Take care of yourself, your friends, your family, your loved ones. If you got to go to work, stay positive as much as you can. Dealing with, these systems out here. If you like your job, that's cool. If you like your job, that's cool. If you're doing it to make ends meet, then, just focus on what you need to focus, while we're here on this planet. All right, family, love, peace, and reparations. And on that note, we will see each other tomorrow. Take care. Have a good evening.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million. And then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, but I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.